Hi everyone, Eric here. Very quickly before we get to our discussion today with Daisy Kambandu in Lusaka, I want to make sure that you know about the daily email newsletter that Cobus and I put together. What we're doing with this newsletter is capturing the conversations that are taking place about China-Africa relations. Whether it's the latest reports from think tanks, scholarly research, what activists are saying, and of course all of the discussions that are taking place on social media. And we're featuring a lot of primary source material. So if you're a researcher, an analyst, or a journalist covering these issues, this newsletter is perfect for you. To find out more, go to chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe. Give it a try free for 2 weeks. See if you like it. And if you use the promo code podcast at checkout, well, we'll give you a big discount. Also, if you're a student or teacher, it's always half price. Once again, that's chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, we're going to focus on Zambia today, and in particular talking about agriculture, but we really have to put this inside a broader context. Zambia is facing a number of different challenges that are quite severe. One by themselves would be really critical, but now we're facing a myriad of problems in Zambia, not just the COVID-19 outbreak that is affecting the entire continent, also the accompanying economic downturn that is putting pressure on people's lives. But Zambia, like a lot of southern African countries, is also facing climate change impacts as well. Most notably, and again, interestingly here, both flood and drought at the same time. According to a 2019-2020 UN humanitarian response plan for Zambia, 2.3 million Zambians are going to need food aid before the next harvest, and it says that about 450,000 of those people require immediate food assistance. This has been compounded this year by severe flash floods that have now impacted 1.1 million Zambians, and the UN World Food Program is now starting to direct aid and relief to those people. And then, so put on top of this, all of these floods, the drought, COVID, the economic disruption, we also have a debt crisis. About $11.2 billion in Eurobond debt and direct debt to bilateral lenders is also prompting a lot more money to be directed to debt servicing and away from agriculture and public health programs. So put all of that together. There are a lot of challenges on Zambia's food security, and that's really, I think, an acute concern, Cobus.
Yes, it also sits in a wider context where a lot of development plans coming out of sub-Saharan Africa really puts agriculture and agri-processing at the center of African future development plans. You know, it's seen as a kind of more ecological and more sustainable alternative to resource extraction. So all of these questions around food security that moment are plaguing national governments also sit in wider continental plans for how food can also be used for development in Africa. So it's this kind of complicated, like, double situation.
So Zambia, like a lot of African countries, imports its food. A lot of its food is unable to feed itself entirely, especially now, again, during some of these crises. So we got to start thinking about what's going to happen in the post-COVID-19 era. Will some of these food imports resume? Will the countries be able to afford, have the hard currency to buy food? And in that case, it's going to start putting pressure on stakeholders in Zambia to start creating solutions of their own. One of the solutions is actually taking place in the China-Africa space, and it's these things called agricultural training and development centers. Now, this goes back to 2006 and the FOCAC summit that was run by, at that time, former President Hu Jintao, and they launched these kind of demonstration centers, which was the idea was to bring private and public stakeholders together to come up with agricultural solutions in a very, I guess it's interesting for me because it's a PPP, a public-private partnership, and we don't usually associate that with Chinese development aid, but in this case, it's quite prominent across Africa, little known. They're operating in more than a dozen countries across the continent. It's been a topic we've been focusing on all year. And we're going to talk about today what the ATDC is doing in Zambia, especially in the larger context of these acute challenges that are facing that. So to help us understand what's going on, we're thrilled to have on the show today for the first time Daisy Kambandu, who is the country program manager for the ATDC program in Zambia. A very good morning to you, Daisy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Morning, Eric. Morning, Cobus.
We set up the fact that in our discussion that the situation is quite dire now in some parts of Zambia. Food security is an issue. Talk to us a little bit about the role that the ATDC is playing in terms of this context of helping to train small-scale and local farmers to be more self-sufficient and possibly mitigate some of these challenges that Zambia is facing.
Yeah, so the vision of the ATDC is to provide basically what you've mentioned, food security and technology transfer for particularly smallholder farmers in the broader context of looking at specific value chains and those value chains that have potential for growth and have potential to increase income for smallholder farmers. So the ATDC's role is basically to provide a platform and a learning space for those smallholder farmers to introduce new farming techniques and new technologies that they can then adopt on their own farms. So as a learning space, the ATDC then becomes a place where those technologies are demonstrated, are also piloted in very specific areas in the country. And then farmers are able to either learn on the demo sites at the ATDC or at the pilot sites and be able to transfer that information using local materials, local information onto their own farms. So at the moment, we're doing that with the village chicken, but the idea is to scale it up to other value chains as well.
So, which partners are involved within the country and then internationally?
So at the moment, and giving the broader context of Zambia's challenges, and also prior to the challenges where we were seeing economic success and graduated into a low middle income country, Zambia began to see fewer development agencies working in country. So there was a significant reduction, especially from European agencies to work specifically in Zambia. So that's why China became a particularly important partner. And that's why the ATDC became very interesting in that it wasn't just looking at the agricultural space, but it was looking at a broader partnership with other Chinese entities. So at the moment, to answer your question, at the moment, the direct partnership is between the University of Zambia, who's considered the local partner and the owner of the ATDC, and Jilin Agricultural University, which is the Chinese partner. And at the moment, we have the two directors from both of those universities, and currently, they're working in partnership with Syngenta. Syngenta has just agreed to set up a demonstration site for one of its maize protective products, as well as horticulture. And the idea is to bring on board additional international partners, particularly Chinese partners, hoping to see that partnership and the relationship grow between China and Zambia.
Who is Syngenta? Explain Syngenta to us.
Syngenta is a agro inputs company. And they recently were bought out by a Chinese entity. So they are also a Chinese company. So they basically provide various different inputs to the farming community. And this includes the seed, it includes fertilizer, it also includes protective products. And they are one of the larger input supply companies in the country.
So this is a very different approach to agricultural assistance than, I think, and again, I'm speculating here, than what, say, the United States Agency for International Development or some of the European aid agencies do. Because from my understanding, and again, I might be completely wrong here, they don't have that corporate partner as part of it. How is this different than, say, what the others have done?
So the idea is to have the ATDC have a specific revenue base where it's able to generate income on its own, and then also have different development partners come on board to implement different projects. So, for instance, the project that we're currently implementing is being funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So what we're actually doing is to help capacitate the center to be able to function sustainably and independently. So under the ATDC project specifically, we're looking at incorporating different protocols and incorporating different activities and systems and procedures within the ATDC so that they're able to transfer that technology onto smallholder farmers, and whichever technology it might be, and whichever value chain.
So you mentioned earlier that the current project is focusing on chickens. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that particular one.
Yeah, sure. So when we were starting the project, we looked at the landscape in Zambia, and we looked at the particular interest of the ATDC, and in particular, like I mentioned, value chains which had the potential for growth and a significant number of smallholder farmers, as well as their potential to generate income from being involved in the value chain. So a number of different value chains were studied, and the village chicken came out as being the most significant out of those three indicators. So on the project, we are setting up a village chicken demonstration site at the ATDC, and that site is looking at various different housing, as well as looking at disease protection, feeding regimes, as well as disease prevention, and looking at different breeds as well for the village chicken to see which ones would actually work best in the Zambian environment. And in addition to that, we're piloting the same concept in Luanshya district, where we'll be working with approximately 2,000 farmers to actually set up the village chicken value chain from production all the way to seeing it on the retail shelf. So we have the farmers producing the village chicken and linking them to a processor, and that processor is then making the product available in the supermarkets. And this is something that hasn't happened in the village chicken space before. So we're piloting it to see if it would work, and then hoping to bring on additional partners that would then take that pilot to scale, so that you're able to see it in some of the larger supermarkets. Because at the moment it's just in some of the smaller supermarkets. But within that, we're looking at very specific technologies that basically transform the village chicken production from a 9-month time period or maturation rate to 3 months. So that's looking at the feeding, that's looking at disease prevention, it's looking at how you're brooding the birds, and etc.
It's interesting how commercially focused it is. When you think of aid programs, and this has been one of the long-standing criticisms of aids, that it creates a certain level of dependency. And it seems like, just from the way you're describing it, that this is meant to be commercially viable and sustainable on its own, without having to be dependent on, say, foreign aid or the Chinese support, 10, 15 years down the road. Is that something that is new in the aid business, or are the Chinese distinctive in their approach, or are other aid agencies also doing something similar from what you can see in Zambia?
So it is a little bit different from the aid agencies, but it is something that we're seeing more in Zambia, even with USAID and even with some of the European aid agencies. They're looking towards sustainability, and they're looking towards making sure that they don't have to come back again and provide the same services. So a lot of the programs that we work in as an organization looks at private sector development, as well as entrepreneurship, and as well as ensuring that farmers are generating sustainable income from the activities that they're doing. So it isn't something new or specific to the Chinese, but it is a newer concept within aid agencies, and I think it's generally the direction that aid agencies are going, at least here in Zambia. And so far we have been seeing some successes. Obviously, there are challenges when working with smallholder farmers, but it is a much more sustainable approach as opposed to the traditional way of providing aid. But as you know, change it takes time, and more traditional aid agencies and more traditional NGOs find it a little bit hard to make that transition. But we've seen so far quite good successes, and we think that it is the way that development agencies will be going in the future.
What is the thinking around the scaling of the project? Is it at the moment? Is there the possibility that it might start feeding into cross-border trade to take advantage of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, or is the planning at the moment mostly regional or national?
So at the moment, more because of production limitations, we're looking a little bit more national. I'm not sure if you're aware, but basically Zambia does consume a large number of chickens, and the broiler market, there was a significant reduction in the broiler chicken market, which has allowed for the village chicken market to increase. And part of the reason why there was a reduction in the broiler chicken market was because of the cost of feed, which basically goes back to what you were talking about in the introduction, where the crop production wasn't as good. And so the price of soybeans went up, the price of maize went up, and everything else, increased as a result. So essentially the village chicken value chain was able to take advantage of that. But because of the reduction in the broiler and production limitations on the village chicken at the moment, we're still seeing a national demand gap, where essentially if we're thinking about scaling it, we're still thinking nationally before we would think regionally. Although markets like the Congo market are particularly interesting for smallholder farmers because they're able to make significant profits from the sale of one or two birds. But obviously, if you're thinking about volumes, then the margins then reduce, which is basically what we're trying to convince the farmers of at the moment.
So the ATDCs, as I mentioned earlier, started in 2006 under President Hu Jintao. And then in Zambia, if I'm correct, your ATDC opened in 2016. Is that right?
The ATDC was completed in about 2010. And from about that time to about 2015, it was primarily being run by JAO, or Jilin Agriculture University, where they were doing a number of research activities, and they were doing a few training activities. But in terms of actually reaching out and doing activities that to scale with smallholder farmers, that only started with the onboarding of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation project, which I'm currently working on. And that essentially started in about 2016 with the study, and then implementation started about a year later.
So one of the things that we've heard from a number of different stakeholders who are involved in ATDCs in other parts of Africa is that there's been a learning curve for the Chinese. This is relatively new for them, unlike, say, the US or Europe, who've had decades and decades of aid experience, and there's a whole industry that's there to support this sector. The Chinese don't have that, and they're learning. Talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges in terms of working with the Chinese and the cultural language, some of the different issues that you've confronted as these ATDCs have ramped up in places like Zambia.
It has definitely been a learning curve, and it is a newer concept for the Chinese in providing aid. They're also a little bit more used to providing the infrastructure and moving on from there. So working specifically on projects and interacting with the local population to provide aid in the traditional sense that we think about it is very new and also very culturally different. So there has been significant learnings and obviously cultural differences in how we engage as different people, from Zambians to the Chinese and vice versa. So in terms of the challenges, I would say definitely language has been a challenge. Although at the moment, I would say out of all the technicians that we have at the ATDC, I think only one doesn't speak English at the moment. So we do have. We were fortunate enough to get Chinese staff that do know English and are able to interact with the locals, and finding the right engagement and finding staff that is much more personable and is willing to understand the local context and understand the local environment as well. So that has been a significant learning, I think, particularly from about 2016, when we started implementing the project, and just being able to go out and understand the cultural differences on both sides. So there has been that learning curve, and there are still challenges, obviously, but I think we are moving in a trajectory that is generally positive. And the good thing is that both institutions want to see the ATDC succeed, so they are willing to go through the hurdles and are willing to learn and see how other aid agencies have interacted. And I think the foundation has been key to this in establishing their office in China as well, and providing indirect guidance on how development is implemented at a local level.
And so in my space, as a kind of a think tank person, I'm frequently in meetings about future African development initiatives, and this idea that there should be triangular cooperation between China, Africa, and a third northern partner is very hip at the moment in these circles, and there's a lot of discussion of it, but almost always in terms of future potential for collaboration. So it's quite rare actually, I think, to see an initiative where a Western partner like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a Chinese partner are working together in Africa. To the extent that you can discuss it, how has that cooperation worked on the ground?
I think it has worked. Like I mentioned, obviously every single new partnership has its own challenges. But it is something that has the potential to continue to work, and as I mentioned, there is a desire from all partners to see this partnership continue to grow and continue to work, and the good thing is that most of the implementation is left to the local partners to be able to figure things out on their own. And so we're basically involved in making sure that that we're able to implement, and having a good relationship with each of the partners also helps, and being a facilitator between the partnerships, and also being a sounding board, and providing the local guidance. So in a nutshell, it is something that does have the potential to work in the future. But I think also, like you've mentioned, China is going generally in providing aid, is going through a learning curve, and I think the northern development agencies and American, European donors also went through learning curves. It's just that they have had 50 years of learning. So I think it's a similar, there would be a similar learning for the Chinese to go through as well. So at some point, I'm pretty certain that there won't even be need for the Northern Partnership. And there are other places where there's interaction directly between a Chinese institution and a local institution, and they're able to implement activities without a third partner.
This has been a very difficult time in China-Zambia relations over the past few weeks. In addition to the situation that happened in Guangzhou back in April, where there were widespread reports of maltreatment and discrimination against Africans, that got people very upset in Zambia and other African countries. We've also had a series of very high-profile showdowns between Lusaka Mayor Miles Sampa, who has gone down to Chinese-owned restaurants, a barbershop, and a Chinese factory, and posted on social media him shutting them down, allegations of discrimination. And then, of course, there was the awful murder of 3 Chinese nationals who were robbed and murdered in Lusaka as well. And so it's been a difficult time, and I'm wondering if your work in a Chinese joint venture project like the ATDC, do some of these negative externalities in the broader relationship find their way into the ATDC, or are you able to kind of wall yourself off from the bigger geopolitical and cultural issues that are influencing the China-Zambia relationship?
I mean, we do see the news, and we do see and we understand, the tensions. But generally speaking, I think between the two partners, they have reached a stage where there's mutual understanding and mutual respect that doesn't really, we're able to basically wall ourselves off from what is happening externally. Although, we obviously do see what is happening. And like I mentioned earlier, there's that positivity to want to see the ATDC succeed from both sides. The University of Zambia sees it as an opportunity to really grow its research arm at a more adaptable level. So at the moment, a lot of the research that is done within the walls of the University of Zambia stay within the University of Zambia and doesn't get translated down to farmer level. So this is an opportunity for that adaptive research to get to farmers, where farmers are able to actually use those technologies. And then for Chilean Agriculture University, it's an opportunity for them to either get international students, which is always a plus for a university, as well as a place where they're able to go and do research outside of China in a different environment. And so generally speaking, they see the ATDCs as an opportunity for the universities to grow. And then as a place where they, can generate additional income, and to be able to see, additional revenue, and to do additional activities, which ultimately translates to them being able to implement more projects.
How do you see the project proceeding from now on over, say, the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
our implementation, we have basically reached a stage where our facilitation role is now really just facilitation. In terms of implementation, we've provided as much guidance and as much, the documents and everything that we were able to do on the program. And so now it is up to the two institutions to take what we have provided to them, strategic plans, business plans, procedures, protocols, etc., and be able to implement them. And having a staffing structure that would allow them to use what we have provided to them, but then also to be able to grow from there. So it is still a bit of a balance at the moment. And we are still involved in providing that facilitation role. But there is significant potential for it to succeed and be able to actually do activities on their own and to get funding from other donor agencies to implement additional programs on their own. So I think it does have potential. Obviously, at the moment, it is operating in a relatively negative environment economically at country level, at macro level. But as an institution and as other development agencies and donor agencies are looking for institutions that are solid enough, that have a firm foundation to work with, I think it is going in the direction of being a very good development partner with enough reach to see impact on the ground with smallholder farmers, which is what development agencies want to see.
A nice positive story for a change on the China-Africa relationship. We've been in a series of negative kind of things. So, Daisy, it's been wonderful to hear your optimism about the future for this program and how important it is, particularly given the timing. Daisy Kambandu is the country program manager for the Agricultural Technology Demonstration Training Center, or ATDC, in the Chonghui district in Lusaka. Daisy, if people want to find out more about what you're doing at the ATDC in Lusaka, is there a website or is there Twitter? Is there any way that people can find information about it?
At the moment, there isn't, but we will be sending that out very soon, actually. But at the moment, we've been very strategic.
You got to tell the story. Public diplomacy, marketing. Yes. This is really important.
Yes, and there's a reason for that. We've been very, very deliberate about how and when we want to start advertising to the world.
Okay.
So at the moment there isn't a website, but there will be soon, and I will share that with you when it's out. We didn't want to share it too soon because the ATDC wasn't at a place where it can start advertising itself because the systems weren't in place, and I felt that it might give it a negative light. And people wouldn't take it as seriously. But we've made significant improvements, and actually this year is when we'll be launching the website and launching whatever other social media. Yes.
Well, as soon as it comes out, please do share it with us, and we will, of course, share it with the audience. Daisy Kambandu, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and explain all the great work that you're doing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Cobus, throughout the discussion with Daisy, I'm thinking to myself as a professional communicator, this is one of China's best success stories in Africa. It's really remarkable. And in so many ways, it challenges some of the hostile narratives against the Chinese about that it's state-led. Oftentimes, the United States and Europe talk about public-private partnerships, but we don't always see a lot of that actually executed on the ground. Here, we're actually seeing things happen. This is not kind of at the state-to-state level, but it's actually at the civil society level, working with small-scale farmers, putting chickens into grocery stores, helping with food security. I mean, the talking points from a propaganda and a public diplomacy messaging point of view are just genius. I mean, they're great. And we don't hear anything about it. And it's really, I don't know, I mean, I'm just It's just my observation, but it just seems like such a missed opportunity on the Chinese side to really tell a positive story, rather than so often we hear the Chinese are positioning themselves against the West, what they call the West, and that people are not giving them the credit and whatnot. But here they have an opportunity to tell an engaging story that no one really knows about. You and I have been covering the China-Africa story for 10 years, and we're new to this. I mean, it's buried. I understand why Daisy doesn't have a website because her specific project is not ready for it. But why the bigger ATDC initiative in Africa isn't communicated more effectively, I don't know, just feels like a missed opportunity to me.
Yeah, I mean, the same is true for health initiatives as well, because obviously China leads on anti-malaria, kind of measures in Africa. So there's a lot to explore there. I assume that, there's maybe two issues. One is just, different agencies and the different ministries and so on not particularly kind of speaking to each other. That might be one thing. And then it might also be that everything at the moment is just in this kind of inflamed space between the US and China. And it's very difficult to talk about positive, triangular cooperation initiatives and so on, in a space where the governments themselves are so hostile.
And I think strategic communications has never really been seen as a priority in not just the Chinese aid industry, which is still relatively new, but the aid industry as a whole. It's always been this kind of thing that if you do good, you should be recognized for it. Now, that's changed a little bit over the past 5 to 10 years, particularly with the big ones like the International Rescue Committee, Doctors Without Borders. They've obviously do a huge push when it comes to marketing and strategic communications. But a lot of smaller NGOs they just don't do it, and they don't know how to do it, and they don't fund it. And it's not a priority. So it's not surprising that they don't have it. But you see a lot of what they're doing here is very visual. So the idea of working with farmers, growing chickens, bringing Chinese agriculture over, seeds, you can have a great story on that. But again, I'm thinking as a visual storyteller, as a journalist, and as a professional communicator. But it just seems like a missed opportunity. One of the things we didn't get to, and I would have liked to have had the chance to speak with her about it, is the fact that every single time we talk about China-Africa agricultural initiatives like the ATDCs, the issue of land grabs comes up. And it's something that we're going to post this show up on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and Facebook. And invariably in the comments, it's going to be China's out to land grab. Why does that happen every single time?
I think it has to do a lot with anxieties that comes from Africa's past. Africa has had a lot of experiences of land grabs, by external actors going back hundreds of years. So I think that it's part of that. It's also part of I think a narrative that China is looking internationally, in particular to Africa, to produce food that it would then import, which we've seen the work of Deborah Brautigam notably has shown that there aren't as many land grabs or many at all, and also that this narrative of China is going to grow food in Africa for China doesn't actually make sense. That kind of value chain does, it's true for certain products like coffee or oranges from South Africa, but it's not sustainable for lettuces and other kinds of things that Chinese consumers want. There, it's much easier to do it closer to home. So there isn't a kind of a narrative set up for China is involved in producing things that will then be sold in Africa. That narrative is a more alien one, and the other one seems to make more sense, I think.
Yes, in fact, Africa is terribly positioned to feed a country like China simply because it doesn't have the large industrial scale agricultural output that, say, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, Europe, and the United States have. China sources its food from those places because it can produce the huge quantities that it needs. I mean, remember, this is a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion people. Africa, for the most part, still has small-scale landholders. So those are not aligned, as you pointed out. So anytime people bring up the idea that China is going to turn to Africa for food production, it reveals the ignorance of that statement simply because the scale of what China needs is so much larger than what Africa can actually produce. That being said, we recently did an interview with Ben Igbakpa, who is the Congress or representative in Nigeria, and our colleague Ovigwe Ego spoke with him. And at the end of the interview, he was inviting Chinese agricultural companies to invest in Nigeria. And so there does seem to be this willingness to do partnerships both on the investment level and at the ATDCs on the part of African stakeholders to engage the Chinese on agricultural development. And it's one of those parts of the story, again, that we don't see as much talked about, and I found that very interesting that in Nigeria they wanted to try and bring in and develop the agricultural sector with both Chinese investment and technology.
Yeah, because the Nigerians are trying to get away from oil as a central pillar for their economy. And when African leaders talk about developing agri-processing for development, this is what they mean. They want to be the new Argentina or the new Brazil. That kind of like large-scale agriculture for export is what they're aiming at. The question, though, is that both in the US and in South America, we've seen that kind of agriculture, the kind of paving over many small farms and over local ecosystems to produce a monoculture, to just 20 square kilometers of soybeans, for example, has been environmentally and socially ruinous. It's a really, really terrible kind of way of producing food. And so the challenge, I think, in Africa is to do it without wrecking the ecosystems and without essentially pushing many small scale farmers off the land and therefore making them kind of move to cities that aren't capacitated to deal with them. So they're looking for ways to try and kind of keep smallholders on the land and then to get everyone together to kind of produce these kind of large scale exportable agricultural commodities. The question is how that is supposed to work, and I think there actually international assistance is valuable, but it's also limited because in a lot of cases, both China and the US and South America provide negative examples, of how not to do it, how not to keep people on the land or how not to wreck, how not to keep ecosystems safe. So in that sense, a lot of local knowledge and local wisdom in Africa will have to be, kind of drawn into the equation.
I'm wondering if in your think tank circles, people are talking about the emerging decoupling of the United States and China and the impact on agriculture, in part because the United States is one of the largest suppliers of food to China in terms of soy, pork, citrus, beef, you name it. The United States sells a lot. But one of the things that we've seen come out of the U.S.-China trade war is that Chinese buying of American agriculture is going down. The Chinese don't seem that excited about living up to their commitments in the Phase 1 trade agreement that committed to buy vast amounts of soybean and other products. They're now shifting a lot of those purchases to Brazil and Argentina and Australia and other places. One of the discussions I had shortly before I left Shanghai last year was with a scholar at a think tank there who said, we're going to stop buying as quickly as possible everything from the United States. That is our goal as well. So the decoupling is happening on both ends of the equation. And I'm wondering if there is any thought in Africa to try and take advantage of this. Is there an opportunity to raise pork or to grow soybeans in such a way that it can make up for some of the gap, because the rest of the world simply cannot produce enough to compete with the Americans or to make up for the American loss? So this seems to me as an opportunity for African farmers to help step in and fill the void if they could produce for export.
There's a mix of opportunities and dangers. On the one hand, I think the opportunities definitely are there, and I think some, especially countries like South Africa, where large-scale agriculture is already a kind of a strong system, to try and take advantage of those, kind of within the limits that they can do, because there's, for example, a limit to the amount of soybeans that South Africa can produce. But yes, I think there's already a push to try and take advantage of that. However, there's also the danger that as producers like the US lose the China market, they start looking around for other markets. And South Africa has already had several trade disputes with the US around dumping issues, particularly around chicken. And so there's been that. South Africa's already battle scarred from dealing with the US in very hard trade negotiations around these issues. And so there is, I think, also fears in Africa that these kinds of projects could simply have the legs cut out from under them by cheap imports, arriving en masse from the US or from Brazil. South Africa had similar fights with Brazil as well. So I think there are both worries and opportunities.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that point, because Kenya is about to sign a free trade agreement with the United States, and that could, of course, open the way up for American agriculture to find its way into to Kenyan stores, which again would be good for Kenyan consumers because it could be cheap, but it would also put pressure on Kenyan producers as well. Two very quick points before we go. Keep an eye out for what's going on in the fish sector. It's looking like because of the disruptions to global trade, that fish supplies, frozen tilapia fish in particular, coming from China have been reduced. Countries from Senegal to Kenya are talking about boosting the domestic fish industry, so that part of the agricultural supply chain is something interesting to watch. The other one is, you mentioned South Africa. I also want to point out Egypt as well is a major citrus producer, and they have been seeing their volumes go up considerably, in part because people are buying more citrus because of their want to boost their immune systems, and one of their biggest markets has been in East Asia. I know from going to the supermarket here in Vietnam, I am seeing Egyptian oranges and grapefruits everywhere. And that's kind of exciting. So Asia as an export market for African citrus is something very exciting. We have not seen much in the way of progress when it comes to avocados coming out of Europe. Out of Kenya, excuse me. They need to be flash frozen, and that has been the big stumbling block of entering into the China market. But at the same time, it's something that I think a lot of people have a lot of hope and optimism that one day we'll start to see a lot more Kenyan avocados make it into the China market frozen at the point of export. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. We're going to continue our discussion in agriculture throughout the rest of the year and going forward. We also have a lot of great material on our website at ChinaAfricaProject.com. Again, this is one of the aspects of the China-Africa relationship that people don't know as much about. It's very, very interesting, very complicated. There are a lot of cultural differences, business differences, and whatnot, but people are working through it, and it's really one of the more exciting, upbeat stories that we have, and Lord knows right now we need a few of those. So I'm happy to be able to finally bring an optimistic, uplifting story to the discussion. So that'll do it. We'll be back again next week with another episode. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.